Detective Elara Vance did not believe in premonitions, but the moment her phone vibrated across the polished mahogany of her precinct desk, a phantom chill sliced through the humid city air. The area code was unfamiliar, a prefix belonging to the vast, arid expanse of the American Southwest, a place she hadn't thought about, actively suppressed thinking about for 3 days. The voice on the other end was desiccated, professional, and carried the unbearable weight of official bad news. It was the county sheriff in a nameless junction town on the edge of the Mojave. They had found the vehicle. For hours later, Elara stood at the terminus of a cracked asphalt road that surrendered to the encroaching sand. The heat was a physical adversary, a relentless pressure that sought to evaporate the moisture from her very eyes. Before her lay the immense, terrifying canvas of the desert basin, a landscape painted in hues of burnt umber, pale ochre, and the blinding white of alkali flats. It was a place of absolute silence, a vacuum where sound went to die, broken only by the blood rushing in her own ears. 100 yards off the macadam, partially obscured by a skeletal cluster of creosote bushes, sat the dust-coated Jeep Wrangler. It belonged to Lucas, her younger brother, the dreamer, the drifter, the one who sought answers in places where humanity was an invasive species. Elara approached the vehicle with the clinical detachment she used at crime scenes, a necessary armor against the rising panic threatening to claw up her throat. The sheriff's deputies had already cordoned off the area with yellow tape that whipped pathetically in the hot, dry wind. They offered nods of condolences that she ignored, her focus narrowing to the scene. The Jeep appeared undamaged. The tires were inflated, resting atop the crusty soil. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, the air was superheated, smelling of old vinyl and the metallic tang of hot electronics. His keys were in the ignition, turned to the off position. His wallet, containing his ID and $300 in cash, sat in the center console. A half-drunk bottle of water, now warm as bathwater, rested in the cup holder. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no chaotic displacement of gravel outside the door. It looked exactly as if Lucas had simply pulled over, turned off the engine, and walked away into an environment that killed unprepared humans in hours. Elara began a grid search of the immediate vicinity, her boots crunching softly on the fragile desert pavement. She was looking for footprints, scuff marks, anything that indicated direction. The wind, however, was an efficient eraser. The ground was a mosaic of undisturbed stones and baked earth. She circled back to the Jeep, her frustration mounting against the monolith of the desert's indifference. Opening the rear tailgate, she rummaged through his gear, hiking pack, an opened freeze-dried meals, a high-end sleeping bag, all present. Then, shoved beneath the passenger seat, she found something the initial sweep had missed. It was a standard topographical map of the quadrant, folded haphazardly. She unfolded it against the hot hood of the car. The map was covered in Lucas's frantic handwriting, coordinates, question marks, and spiraling patterns in black ink. But it was the center of the map that made her breath hitch. In the middle of a vast, featureless white space denoting a dry lake bed, Lucas had drawn a perfect, heavy black circle, and inside the circle, he had sketched a shape that Elara recognized with sickening clarity from their shared, turbulent childhood, a shape he used to draw when the night terrors came. A single, weeping eye. The official search was a symphony of impotence. Helicopters chopped the thin air overhead, their thermal imaging cameras rendered largely useless by the ground retaining the day's brutal heat well into the night. Ground teams on ATVs kicked up plumes of fine silt that hung in the air like fog, obscuring more than they revealed. Elara operated on the periphery of this activity, a rogue element tolerated only because of her badge and her blood relation. She knew, with the instinct of a predator, that Lucas was not in the obvious places. He had not wandered off the road to take a leak and gotten turned around. The map in the Jeep was a statement of intent. By dawn of the second day, the search commander was already talking about scaling back, shifting terminology from rescue to recovery. The desert was vast, and the resources of a small county were finite. Elara ignored their briefings. She took her own rented 4x4, loaded with extra water and fuel, and drove away from the hub of activity. Guided by the frantic ink on Lucas's map. She headed toward the ancient dry lake bed, a prehistoric seabed calcified into a blinding white expanse that stretched for 20 miles. Driving onto the playa felt like navigating the surface of an alien moon. The tires hummed over the cracked hexagonal plates of salt and clay. The heat haze created shimmering mirages, phantom lakes of mercury that vanished as she approached. The horizon was a flat, trembling line that offered no fixed point of reference. In this void, distance became meaningless. A dark shape ahead could be a rock the size of a fist or a mountain range 10 miles away. She stopped in the approximate center of the playa, near where Lucas had drawn the weeping eye. The silence here was deeper, heavier than near the road. It was a primeval quiet. Stepping out of the truck, the sun hit her with the force of a physical blow. The ground beneath her boots was hard as concrete, glittering with crystallized salt. She began to walk, scanning the horizon with high-powered binoculars. There was nothing. No tracks could survive here. The wind scoured the surface smooth every afternoon. Hours passed in a monotonous rhythm of walking, scanning, and hydrating. Her mind began to drift, the isolation eroding her professional facade. She remembered Lucas as a boy, always bringing home injured things, birds with broken wings, lizards missing tails. He had a terrifying capacity for empathy, a trait the world had tried very hard to beat out of him. He had come to the desert, he told her once, because it was the only place honest enough to admit it wanted to kill you. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Elara spotted an anomaly. Miles to the east, protruding from the perfectly flat white surface, was a dark, vertical sliver. It shouldn't have been there. She drove toward it, the truck kicking up a contrail of white powder. As she neared, the shape resolved into a solitary, withered wooden post, driven deep into the salt crust. It was ancient, the wood bleached gray and splintered by decades of sun and wind. Tacked to the post with a rusted nail was a tattered piece of canvas, flapping weakly. Elara pried it loose. It was part of an old surveying marker, perhaps from a century ago. But on the back of the canvas, scrawled recently in charcoal, were 3 words that sent a tremor through her exhausted body. Words that confirmed Lucas had stood at this exact spot, alive and terrified. It sees me. The clue on the salt flat acted as a lodestone, pulling Elara further into the desert's hostile embrace. The search coordinators had practically given up, their resources stretched thin and their optimism evaporated by the 100-degree heat. Elara was alone now. She spent the night in her vehicle, fitfully sleeping as the desert temperature plummeted. The extreme oscillation from oven to freezer, another weapon in the landscape's arsenal. The morning of the 3rd day broke crystal clear and painfully bright. Elara traced a line from the wooden post on the lake bed towards the jagged peaks of a distant, unnamed mountain range to the north. The terrain shifted as she left the playa, turning into a brutal obstacle course of sharp volcanic rock, deep arroyos, and deceptive patches of soft sand waiting to mire her vehicle. Progress was agonizingly slow. She had to constantly stop, assess the terrain, and sometimes backtrack to find a passable route. By mid-afternoon, she reached the foothills of the mountains. Here, the geography folded in on itself, creating deep canyons that remained in perpetual shadow. The temperature dropped slightly in these fissures, but the sense of claustrophobia increased. The towering walls of red and black rock loomed over her, ancient striations revealing millions of years of geological violence. It was in one of these box canyons, hidden behind a massive rockfall, that she found the structure. It was a shack, cobbling together from scavenged corrugated metal, sun-warped plywood, and tar paper. It looked less like a human habitation and more like debris left behind by a flash flood. A chimney made of rusted coffee cans poked precariously from the roof. Elara approached cautiously, her hand resting on the butt of her service weapon hidden beneath her linen shirt. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something unwashed. She announced herself, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast canyon space. There was no answer. Pushing open the rickety door, she entered the hovel. It was surprisingly orderly inside. Shelves made of stacked stones held jars of preserved food. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling, and a neatly made cot sat in the corner. The inhabitant was clearly a long-term survivalist, someone who had made their peace with the harsh environment. On a rough-hewn table in the center of the room sat a collection of geological samples: quartz, obsidian, hematite arranged in precise geometric patterns. In the center of this arrangement rested a modern digital camera. Elara picked it up. The battery was nearly dead, but she managed to power it on. The memory card contained hundreds of photos. Most were landscapes, stark and beautiful images of the desert at dawn and dusk. But the last few dozen photos were different. They were taken with a telephoto lens, capturing a figure in the far distance, walking across the salt flats. It was Lucas. He was tiny in the frame, a speck against the white void. The photographer had tracked him for miles. Elara scrolled through them rapidly, her heart hammering. The final image on the camera was not of Lucas. It was a close-up of the dirt outside the shack's door, taken perhaps only hours before Elara arrived. Drawn in the dust was the weeping eye symbol. Next to it, an arrow pointed directly toward the back wall of the canyon, where a narrow, almost invisible fissure split the rock face, a pathway leading straight into the mountain's dark heart. The fissure behind the hermit shack was barely wide enough for Elara to squeeze through sideways. It was a geological throat, swallowing the light. She left the bulk of her gear in the truck, taking only essentials: water, a high-lumen tactical flashlight, a backup battery, and her weapon. The air inside the crack was cool and smelled of damp limestone and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the searing world outside. As she pushed deeper, the fissure opened into a natural cave system. The beam of her flashlight cut through the subterranean gloom, revealing stalactites hanging like jagged teeth from the ceiling and flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls of rock. The silence here was different from the desert above. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the weight of the mountain bearing down on her. There were signs of passage, scuff marks on the stone floor that hadn't been dusted over by time, a discarded energy bar wrapper shoved into a crevice. Lucas had been here. The realization brought a surge of adrenaline that warred with her growing dread. Why would he come down here? Lucas suffered from mild claustrophobia. He hated enclosed spaces. For him to willingly enter this labyrinth meant he was driven by something stronger than his deepest fears. The cave system was vast, a sprawling network of chambers and tunnels that could easily hide an army. Elara navigated by instinct and the faint trail of disturbances left in the dust. She descended deeper, the air growing thinner and colder, her breath plumed in front of her face. She lost track of time. Down here, day and night were irrelevant concepts. There was only rock and darkness. After what felt like hours of squeezing through tight passages and scrambling over rockfalls, the tunnel opened into an immense cavern. Her flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling or the far wall. The echo of her boots on the stone floor bounced back to her seconds later, emphasizing the enormous scale of the space. In the center of this cathedral of rock, there was a pool of perfectly still, black water. It was impossibly clear. When she shone her light into it, she could see rock formations deep beneath the surface, magnifying the depth. The water was a mirror, reflecting nothing but darkness. On the shore of this subterranean lake, Elara found Lucas's backpack. It was neatly placed on a flat stone, as if waiting for him to return. She opened it. His supplies were largely untouched. His wallet was there. His phone was there, dead. But his journal, the leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere, was missing. She knelt by the water's edge, shining her light across the glassy surface. The absolute stillness of the water was unnerving. Then, she noticed something near the center of the pool, a ripple, just a slight disturbance, shattering the perfect mirror reflection. Then another. Something was breaking the surface from below. Elara stood, her hand moving to her holster, the flashlight beam trained on the center of the black water. Slowly, silently, an object rose from the depths. It wasn't Lucas. It was a perfectly spherical, polished stone orb, jet black and about the size of a basketball. It floated on the surface, buoyant despite its apparent weight, and carved into its surface, gleaming wet in the flashlight beam, was the weeping eye. Elara backed away from the subterranean pool, her mind refusing to process the impossible floating stone. The cavern, once silent, now seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that she felt in her teeth more than she heard. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her professional armor. She grabbed Lucas's backpack and fled back into the tunnel network, the darkness behind her feeling predatory. Reaching out to snag her ankles, the ascent was a nightmare of scraping rock and shallow breathing. She made wrong turns in the labyrinth, doubling back in frantic circles, her flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the gloom. The air felt thinner, heavier, suffocating her. By the time she saw the faint gray light of the fissure exit, her lungs were burning and her hands were raw and bleeding from scrambling over sharp rocks. She burst out into the canyon heat like a diver breaking the surface, gasping for air that tasted of hot dust instead of damp limestone. The sun was high. She had been underground for an entire night, though it felt like only hours. The hermit's shack was still empty, the geological specimens on the table undisturbed. Elara stumbled back to her truck, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenal crash. She needed to leave, to get back to signal range, to report. What? A floating rock in a cave. They would think the heat had snapped her mind. She drank warm water greedily, trying to flush the metallic taste of terror from her mouth. As she drove back through the twisting canyons, navigating towards the open expanse of the salt flats, the desert began to warp around her. Fatigue and dehydration were taking their toll. The rocks seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, forming fleeting shapes that looked like crouching figures. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon conjured impossible cities of glass and water that dissolved as she approached. She recognized the symptoms of heat exhaustion and severe cognitive strain. She needed to stop, rest, and cool down, but the compulsion to keep moving, to escape the proximity of that cave, drove her onward. She was operating on pure, desperate instinct. Miles out onto the blinding white playa, her truck engine sputtered and died. She cranked the ignition, but it just clicked dryly. Out of fuel, she had miscalculated in her panic. She was stranded in the dead center of the kill zone, 10 miles from the nearest paved road. With the midday sun hammering down like a physical weight, Elara sat in the rapidly heating cab, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Panic was a death sentence out here. She had water. She had a flare gun. She had to wait for nightfall to attempt walking out. As she stared out at the shimmering white void, a figure detached itself from the heat haze. It was walking toward the truck, unhurried, seemingly unaffected by the lethal temperature. Elara blinked, rubbing her eyes, sure it was a hallucination born of stress. But the figure remained, growing larger, more distinct. It was a man. He was dressed in outdated, tattered clothing, a heavy wool coat, and a wide-brimmed felt hat, completely inappropriate for the weather. He walked with a strange, loping gait. He didn't look at the truck. His gaze was fixed on something far beyond her. He passed within 20 feet of her window. Elara couldn't move, couldn't speak. As he passed, she saw his face beneath the shadow of his hat. It was leathery, desiccated, the skin pulled tight over the skull. His eyes were entirely white, cataracts clouding them like spoiled milk. It was the hermit from the photos. He walked past her stalled vehicle and continued into the white nothingness, leaving no footprints on the salt crust. Elara watched until the impossible figure of the hermit dissolved back into the shimmering heat waves. She checked her own pulse. It was racing, thready. Was she hallucinating? Had the isolation finally broken her? She couldn't trust her own senses anymore. The desert was a hall of mirrors, reflecting her own anxieties back at her in warped, terrifying forms. Nightfall brought relief from the sun, but replaced it with an oppressive, crushing darkness. The sky was a spectacular, indifferent blanket of stars. Elara began the long walk toward the distant highway, navigating by the stars and the faint, jagged silhouette of the mountains on the horizon. The temperature plummeted, chilling the sweat on her skin. The silence of the playa at night was not total. It was filled with acoustic shadows, strange auditory phenomena caused by the unique geography. She heard sounds that shouldn't exist there, the distant peal of church bells, the rumble of a phantom freight train, the faint, snatching sound of a child crying. She knew these were tricks of the wind passing over distant rock formations, sounds carried for dozens of miles and distorted by the atmospheric layers. Yet, every sound made her flinch, her hand tightening on her weapon. After 6 hours of walking, her legs cramping and her mind numb, she reached the paved road. The asphalt felt miraculously solid beneath her boots. She walked along the shoulder until the headlights of a long-haul trucker cut through the darkness. The driver, a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, picked her up without question. Radioing the authorities, back in the sterile, fluorescent reality of the county sheriff's station, Elara's story sounded insane even to her own ears. She reported finding the jeep, the map, the post on the salt flat. She omitted the floating sphere and the phantom hermit. She couldn't risk being pulled off the case for psychiatric reasons. The sheriff listened skeptically, his patience worn thin. The official search was over. Lucas was presumed a casualty of the elements. Elara was released, told to go home, to grieve. Instead, she checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. She couldn't leave. Not yet. She laid out everything she had found on the sagging mattress, the map, the canvas from the post, Lucas's backpack contents. She picked up Lucas's phone. It was still dead, but she plugged it into her charger. After 10 minutes, the screen lit up. It was password protected, of course, but she knew Lucas. She tried the date of their mother's death. It unlocked. She went straight to his voice memos. There was one new recording. Made the day he disappeared. It was 3 hours long. She pressed play. For the first 2 hours, there was only the sound of wind and Lucas's ragged breathing, the crunch of his boots on rocks. He was walking, climbing. Occasionally, he would mutter unintelligible things, prayers or curses. Then, around the 2.5-hour mark, the sounds changed. The wind died down. The acoustic quality shifted, becoming echoing and cavernous. He was inside the cave. Then, Lucas spoke clearly, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and awe that chilled Elara to the bone. "It's true," he whispered into the microphone. Everything the old man said was true. The eye is open. The frequency, I can feel it vibrating in my skull. It's singing to me. There was a long pause, filled with a strange, low-frequency thrumming sound that the phone's microphone barely picked up. Then Lucas's voice returned, sounding distant, detached. "Elara, if you find this, don't come looking. It remembers you, too." The recording ended abruptly, leaving Elara sitting in the dim motel room, the silence ringing in her ears. "It remembers you, too." The phrase was a psychic hook, dragging up memories she had spent a lifetime burying under layers of professionalism and logic. The weeping eye, the night terrors, the shared, secret language of their traumatic childhood in that rattling farmhouse with a father who saw demons in the whiskey bottle. Lucas hadn't come to the desert to get lost. He had come to find something he believed was calling to him, something connected to their past. The old man he mentioned it had to be the hermit. Lucas had met him, listened to his madness, and believed it. Elara spent the next day utilizing resources she shouldn't have had access to. She called in favors from federal contacts, running background checks on a ghost. It took hours to get a hit on the description of the hermit, cross-referencing missing persons from decades ago with sparse desert encounters. His name was Elias Vance, their father's younger brother. Their uncle. He had vanished 30 years ago, long before Elara was born, a brilliant but unstable geologist who became obsessed with acoustic anomalies in the Mojave. The family narrative was that he had died in a mining accident, his body never recovered. But here he was, living like a feral prophet in the canyons, feeding Lucas's inherited instability with his own. The connection changed everything. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a family pathology playing out on a geological scale. Elara realized that the weeping eye wasn't just a childhood doodle. It was something their uncle had shown their father, something that had infected their entire bloodline with a specific kind of madness. She had to go back. Not to the cave. The thought of that black water still made her nauseous, but to the source. The hermit's shack. She needed to understand what Elias had told Lucas. She rented another vehicle, a heavier-duty off-road truck, and stocked it with enough supplies for a week. She drove out as the sun was setting, turning the desert into a landscape of long, distorted shadows. She navigated the treacherous canyon roads by memory and feel, the dread growing heavier with every mile. When she reached the box canyon, night had fallen completely. The shack was dark, silhouetted against the star field. She approached cautiously, flashlight drawn. The door was ajar, creaking gently in the wind. Inside, the shack had been tossed. The geological specimens were smashed on the floor. The cot was overturned. It looked like a struggle, or a fit of rage. In the center of the debris, painted onto the floorboards in what looked dangerously like dried blood, was a massive, sprawling map. It was more detailed than the one Lucas had, covering hundreds of square miles of the desert. It was covered in complex equations relating to sound frequencies and geological resonance. And right in the center of the painted map, where the cave system would be, Elias had scrawled a final message. It wasn't a warning this time. It was an invitation. The convergence is now. Bring her. The message on the floorboards was a physical blow. Bring her. Elara stared at the words, her blood running cold. Elias knew she was coming. He had been watching, waiting, perhaps orchestrating this entire nightmare to draw her out here. Lucas was just bait. The fear was now subsumed by a cold, hard rage. Her family had been tormented by the shadows of this desert for 2 generations. It ended tonight. She photographed the map on the floor, studying the complex web of lines and frequencies. It appeared to pinpoint a specific location deeper in the mountains, a place where several geological fault lines intersected. Elias called it the convergence. She returned to her truck and drove deeper into the labyrinth in canyons, following the crude geometry of the blood map. The terrain became increasingly hostile, the track barely wide enough for the tires. Rock walls scraped the sides of the truck, screeching like tortured metal. The GPS was useless here. The mountains blocked all signals. She was navigating solely by the map and a grim determination. After 2 hours of white-knuckle driving, the canyon opened up into a massive, bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering, jagged peaks. It was a natural amphitheater, hidden from the world. The air here felt supercharged, crackling with static electricity. The hair on Elara's arms stood straight up. In the center of this natural bowl, illuminated by the starlight, stood a bizarre structure. It looked like a massive tuning fork made of welded scrap metal and crystalline rock formations, reaching 50 feet into the air. Cables ran from the structure into the ground. It was vibrating, emitting the same low-frequency hum she had felt in the cave, but exponentially stronger here. It rattled her teeth and made her vision blur. Standing at the base of this monolithic machine was the figure in the coat and hat. Elias Vance. He was waiting for her. Elara stopped the truck 50 yards away, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was immediately filled by the oppressive thrum of the machine. She stepped out, her weapon drawn and leveled at the figure. Elias Vance, she shouted, her voice fighting against the sonic pressure. Where is my brother? The figure slowly turned. Even at this distance, she could see the uncanny whiteness of his cataract-filled eyes catching the starlight. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in greeting. He is preparing, Elara. Elias called out, his voice surprisingly strong, resonant. He is shedding the final layers of the false world, just as you are. Tell me where he is, or I swear to God I will put you down, she yelled, advancing slowly. Elias laughed, a dry, cracking sound like rocks grinding together. God isn't here, girl. Only the frequency, the song of the earth. Your father heard it, but he was too weak. He let it break him. Lucas heard it, and he embraced it. And you've heard it your whole life, haven't you? The weeping eye in the dark. He gestured to the massive metal structure tower behind him. It's almost time. The alignment is complete. The membrane is thinnest here. Tonight, we don't just hear the song, we become it. Before Elara could react, Elias pulled a large lever at the base of the machine. The humming intensified into a deafening roar. The ground beneath Elara's feet began to shake violently. Cracks appeared in the desert floor, spider webbing outwards from the machine. A brilliant, pulsing column of violet light erupted from the top of the structure, piercing the night sky, a beacon calling to something beyond the stars. The seismic violence threw Elara to the ground. The roar of the machine drowned out all thought, a sonic weapon that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. The violet pillar of light intensified, plasma-like, tearing at the fabric of the night sky above the canyon. The air pressure plummeted, making her ears pop painfully through the blinding light and dust. She saw Elias kneeling at the base of the machine, his arms outstretched in ecstatic welcome, his figure silhouetted against the unearthly glow. He was chanting, words lost in the cacophony. Elara struggled to her feet, fighting the vertigo induced by the sonic waves. She had to stop this, whatever this was. She raised her weapon, aiming for the control panel where Elias had pulled the lever. It was a desperate shot through a chaotic environment. She fired 3 times. Sparks showered from the machinery. The massive metal tuning fork shuddered violently. The violet light fluctuated, pulsing wildly, then changed color, shifting into a sickly, abrasive green. The harmonic hum twisted into a shrieking dissonance that felt like a physical assault on the brain. Elias screamed a sound of pure agony and fury. The backlash of energy lifted him off his feet and threw him backward against the rocks. He crumpled and lay still. The machine began to tear itself apart. Metal shrieked as bolts sheared off. The ground shook with renewed intensity. A massive fissure opened up in the center of the natural amphitheater, swallowing the machine as it collapsed inward. The green light flared one last blinding time, and then, with a sound like the sky cracking open, everything vanished. Silence slammed back into place, heavier and more out than before. The light was gone. The humming ceased. The ground stopped shaking. There was only dust hanging in the starlight and the smell of ozone and burning metal. Elara moved cautiously toward the center of the crater where the machine had been. The fissure was deep, a jagged wound in the earth. Lying near the edge, half buried in debris, was Elias. She checked him. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was ragged, blood trickling from his ears and nose. His eyes, those terrible white eyes, fluttered open. They tried to focus on her. You broke the song," he wheezed, his voice a faint rattle. "Fool girl, you don't know what you've done. You didn't stop it. You just diverted it. Where is Lucas?" she demanded, leaning close. "Tell me where he is." Elias coughed, blood sputtering on his lips. A ghastly smile twisted his face. "He's gone through the cave. The water. It was the gateway. I sent him through before you arrived. He's on the other side now." In the silent place, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his bone-dry fingers digging into her flesh. "But you are trapped here. With the echo. You broke the doorway. Elara. Now the things that were waiting on the threshold, they are stuck here with you." His eyes rolled back, and his grip slackened. Elias Vance was dead. Elara stood alone in the silent crater. The words sank in. "Stuck here with you." As if in response, a sound drifted on the wind from the darkness outside the canyon bowl. It wasn't a coyote or the wind. It was a low, chittering sound, like quartz stones being clicked together. Then another sound answered it from the opposite direction. And another. They were surrounding the canyon. Elara retreated to her truck, the clicking sounds multiplying in the darkness beyond the canyon rim. They were rhythmic, communicating, closing in. She keyed the ignition. The truck groaned but didn't turn over. The electromagnetic pulse from the machine's destruction had fried the electronics. She was stranded. She grabbed the emergency flare gun and her service weapon, abandoning the metal coffin of the truck. She scrambled up the side of the crater, seeking high ground on the jagged rocks that formed the amphitheater's rim. Below, shadows were detaching themselves from the canyon walls, moving with jerky, insectoid grace toward the wreckage. They were indistinct shapes, darker than the surrounding night, absorbing starlight rather than reflecting it. She fired a flare into the center of the bowl. The brilliant red phosphorus light illuminated the scene for 20 seconds of terrifying clarity. The creatures were humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, possessing extra joints that bent at sickening angles. Their skin looked like scorched rock, faceted and armored. Where faces should have been, they were only smooth, featureless surfaces marked by a single, familiar indentation, a weeping eye carved into the flesh. There were dozens of them. They recoiled from the red light, chittering furiously, their heads snapping toward her position on the ridge. The flare sputtered and died, plunging the canyon back into near total darkness. The chittering intensified into a shriek, the same dissonant sound the machine had made before it died. They began to climb the walls toward her, moving with impossibly fast, scuttling motions. Elara ran. She scrambled over the razor-sharp peaks of the mountain range, sliding down scree slopes in the dark, tearing her clothes and skin. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit were relentless. They didn't tire. They didn't slow down. She ran until her body gave out, collapsing on a high plateau miles from the convergence point. She lay on the cold stone, her chest heaving, waiting for the end. She gripped her gun, saving the last bullet for herself. The chittering drew closer. Then, just as the first shadow crested the ridge line, the sun crested the eastern horizon, the first ray of direct sunlight hit the creature. It didn't burn. It simply ceased to be. The shadow evaporated like steam on a hot griddle. The chittering stopped instantly. As the light spread across the desert landscape, the threat evaporated with the darkness. Elara stood up, trembling uncontrollably. She was alone in the immense, silent beauty of the morning desert. She began the long walk back towards civilization. It took her 2 days. When she finally reached a highway and flagged down a car, she was barely recognizable. The official report stated that Detective Elara Vance had suffered a severe psychotic break brought on by dehydration, heat stroke, and grief during the unsupervised search for her brother. The body of the hermit, Elara Vance, was recovered, along with evidence of his disturbed mind. Lucas Vance remained a missing person, presumed dead. The seismic anomaly and the destroyed machine were written off as an unreported minor earthquake and an illegal desert dumping site. Elara was placed on indefinite psychiatric leave. She didn't fight it. She sat in her quiet apartment in the city, staring at the wall. She knew the truth. The official story was a lie designed to cover a reality the human mind couldn't accept. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city noise died down, she would hear it. A faint, rhythmic clicking coming from the corners of her room. And when she closed her eyes, she didn't see darkness. She saw a vast, subterranean lake of black water, ripples breaking the surface as something slowly rose from the depths to greet her. She knew that Lucas wasn't dead. He was just waiting on the other side of the silence. And now, she knew exactly how to get there.